Researcher over at UC in the Department of Linguistics. She's also at the same time a visiting scholar and in the Department of Native American Studies. She earned her Ph.D. at University of Arizona Tucson, supported by NSF, Dumbarton Oaks, and the University of Arizona. And she has a minor in spatial analysis and remote sensing. She describes herself as an anthropological archaeologist, studying development of socio-political complexity in Mesoamerica, and emphasizing connections between past material practices and culture change. Her work is combining her field work in Guatemala with quantitative studies of ceramics, settlement pattern, and hieroglyphics. Her current research is linguistic diversity and social change through Maya hieroglyphic writing. She's taught a little at UC Davis, at Simon Fraser, and at U of A, and she's published in almost every current anthropological journal there is, as well as Journal of Archaeological Method and Theory, Anthropological Archaeology, and Archaeological Science. Her publications range from Maya Obsidian Exchange and Flakestone Production to Political Rhetoric to, I love it, Homebrew and Chichi Production in Peru. So today, she's talking to us about cultural variation in classic Maya royal rituals, a lexical perspective. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Jessica Munson.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Laura, for that very kind introduction.
And I forgot, she's just accepted a teaching position in Pennsylvania.
So my stay in Davis will be short-lived, unfortunately. So thank you all for coming out today. So today I'm going to be talking about classic Maya rituals, and so just to kind of orient you, what we see here is a dancing ritual that's painted on a ceramic vase from the site of Altar de Sacrificios, where I'm actually going to be starting a new project next year. And so here we see these costumed individuals in various poses, and they're impersonating different animals and mythical beings. So we're going to be examining, we're going to be talking about these and other different types of different dynastic rituals through evidence presented in the hieroglyphic text. So here we see adorning the top of this vase, and then scattered throughout we see these small hieroglyphic texts. So that's going to be the focus of the talk. And so this, the research that I'm going to be presenting is part of a larger project that I've been involved with called the Maya Hieroglyphic Database project, and this research benefits from collaborations with folks at UC Davis as well as at Chico. So I'm just going to walk you through the outline of my talk briefly. So first, I want to provide a little bit of background for you on classic Maya dynastic rituals, and make the case that we can think of these in terms of costly displays from a signaling perspective. Then, let's see, and then I'm going to introduce the data set and describe the basic spatial and temporal patterning that we see in these rituals as they're recorded on hieroglyphic monuments. And then finally, I will present some different measures of ritual diversity to examine what factors may be contributing to the variation that we see in the documentary record. So I'm sorry to say that this presentation is not going to deal too much with material culture. So for most of you who are probably archaeologists, I apologize. But the quantified historical approach that I'm going to outline is one that draws upon methods and theories that many of you in the room will be familiar with, and I think can be more broadly applied to future studies that we're going to be doing with material correlates of these behaviors, as well as other variables in the hieroglyphic texts. Okay, so I just want to start off by drawing your attention to the broader anthropological framework in which I'm situating this work. So drawing upon some of Roy Rappaport's ideas, we can view ritual as a form of communication. So in particular, in the performance of ritual transmits messages about an individual's status as well as the status of groups. And I'm going to kind of make that differentiation a little bit in a moment. So while our observations as archaeologists are, a step or more removed from these actual ritual, the ritual act itself, the documentation of these events, I would argue, on these kind of grand stone-carved monuments in public spaces also serve as a vehicle for communicating information. So in addition, many social scientists have commented on the collective benefits of ritual for bringing groups together, for creating communal identities, for promoting solidarity. And we'll kind of evaluate how this interpretation holds up for classic Maya dynastic rituals. Then more recently, these ideas about ritual, both their effects and function for the development of complex societies, have been integrated with contemporary evolutionary perspectives to create a formalized framework for examining how and why these cultural traits varied and spread in the past. And so that's kind of where this work in particular takes off. Okay. So in the context of this study, dynastic rituals are defined, we can kind of define them as ceremonies that were performed by central political figures, rulers and other members of the royal court in classic Maya society. And here we see an example of a ruler from the site of Dos Pilas. He has he's adorned in his ceremonial regalia. He has this elaborate headdress on and back rack, and he's holding a staff in one hand and a shield in the other. And he's actually preparing for a ritual dance. So some scholars refer to these rituals in terms of their theatricality, and to include the active involvement of multiple participants and audience members in these public performances. So, paying attention to both the main protagonist as well as the people that kind of support the preparation and the people that kind of observe and perhaps engage in these rituals as well. And so in particular, this perspective emphasizes that these ceremonies were opportunities to create and reinforce community identities. And archaeologically, I hope you can see that okay, archaeologically we can find evidence for these ritual performances in the layout and plazas found at ancient Maya cities. And this is an example from Tikal. So we see the central part, this is a photograph taken from the top of Temple 2. So this is the great plaza, and the scale kind of gives you a sense of how many people could fit into one of these open spaces where these rituals were being performed. And so from that great plaza, which is located right here, there are several causeways that are radiating outwards to other temple complexes. And we see this kind of settlement layout repeated at multiple Maya sites in the Maya lowlands. And these causeways likely would have been used, or it's been proposed that they would have been used for ceremonies and processions, such as we see in this example of graffiti from Tikal, where you have the ruler seated on top of this large litter being carried with this huge statue of himself or of an ancestor, perhaps. So other scholars have focused more specifically on the main protagonists, on these rulers and members of the royal court who are engaged in these rituals, and the individual benefits they accrue by engaging in these costly displays. So from this perspective, first and foremost, the performance of these dynastic rituals was a primary responsibility of the ruler. Classic Maya kings are thought to have been imbued with divine powers, and this is expressed directly through their their titular role as Kuhulahau, which translates directly to Holy Lord. And they were responsible for doing things like ensuring good harvest, communing with ancestors and deities, among various other social obligations. So an important function of these rituals, especially as expressed in the monumental art, was to kind of provide a mechanism to legitimate themselves and their office of kingship. So I'm not the first person to consider classic Maya monuments as a costly signal. Fraser Nyman originally introduced this concept to Mesoamerican archaeology by arguing that these large stone-carved monuments constitute reliable, although wasteful, advertisements of a ruler's ability to outcompete his political neighbors. So, but in that original study, and that was a pretty seminal paper that has been replicated over and over again, but that study and the others that have come after have only looked at the terminal monument dates on these stone-carved monuments to examine the spatial patterning of collapse, basically. And so those studies essentially ignore everything but the latest date on one single monument at every site, and none of those studies take into account the rich historical information that's encoded in these texts. And so this is where our study kind of departs from these earlier ones. So scholars of Maya art and epigraphy have identified three main categories of royal rituals, and these were supposedly the primary dynastic obligations that were required of Maya kings. So the first that I'll talk about is bloodletting and conjuring, and here we see a scene in the lintel from Yash Tulan of a royal woman who's just engaged in a bloodletting sacrifice. She's holding a bowl of ritual objects that facilitated that ritual, and there's another bowl at her feet. And so what would have happened is the blood sacrifice would have been dripped onto paper and then burned, and then what we see emanating from that burning paper is a serpent figure, and then an ancestor or deity individual emerging from that serpent's mouth and communing with the royal woman.
I need a little help. I'm seeing what you're seeing.
Okay, so here's the woman. She's holding this bowl. This is just a detail. Okay. And there's another similar bowl containing similar paper with spots on it. And then there's this serpent figure. And then there's a more human-like
there's his face. Okay.
Figure emerging from the mouth of that serpent.
Serpent smoke sort of thing, or?
Yeah.
No. Okay.
So in a recent study, we looked at the distribution of hieroglyphic signs that refer to these bloodletting rituals to kind of get an understanding of how pervasive this ritual was and in what context it was mentioned. Because in the literature, people kind of make a big deal about this as if, this is a major important ritual that all, Maya kings do. However, what we found is that it's surprisingly uncommon, and it has a strong positive association with statements of like warfare and conflict. So it's occurring in the hieroglyphic record in these antagonistic contexts, as opposed to other dynastic events, which is what we might assume from the literature. So this conflation of royal rituals is actually quite common, and here we see an example of a deity impersonation, which is another common, one of the three primary dynastic rituals that's been proposed. So this is another representation of a king, and he's wearing a headdress and mask, and he's impersonating the jaguar fire god. but at the same time, he's also standing on top of this poor captive who he's just sacrificed. He has his arms bound behind his back, and he's holding probably some kind of obsidian blade that was involved in that. The third category of royal rituals defined or proposed by previous scholars is this ritual dance where rulers don ceremonial regalia, and in this case we see two figures. On the right is the king, on the right is his son, the heir to the throne, and they're both participating in this ritual where they're both holding bird staffs that are quite similar, and they're both wearing the same kind of bird headdress. Okay. So to sum up what we know, or rather what we think we know from about classic Maya dynastic rituals, I'll just say two things. They were political performances that created opportunities for creating and maintaining community identities through the celebration of a ruler's political and military power. Scholars have also identified a handful of highly specialized ritual obligations that were required for rulers or members of the royal court. And so there's this idea, there's sort of this dichotomy where some people are kind of promoting a more group-oriented perspective in thinking about these rituals, and others are promoting a more individualistic perspective. But the idea is that that there was probably variation within these ritual traditions. And so then we can ask the question, to what degree did these traditions diverge and across classic Maya kingdoms? So what kinds of ritual performances were essential or specific to the maintenance of a ruler's identity or a community's identity? And so that's what we're going to kind of be looking at. So as a starting point, we can use inscriptions from the hieroglyphic monuments to examine the distribution of these primary rituals that we just talked about. So bloodletting and conjuring, dancing, and impersonation. And what we see just kind of off the bat is that accession rituals, which are in blue, are nearly ubiquitous. So these are the kinds of dynastic events that are associated with a ruler taking office. And they occur at both large and small sites. But when we look at these three primary categories that have been proposed in the literature, we see a lot of variation in terms of where and the relative frequency of their of the spatial patterning.
Are those individual rulers?
These are these represent individual sites. Okay. And so just to clarify, the size of so these are all sites that have hieroglyphic monuments, and the size of the pie chart represents the relative number of texts at each site, and then the contribution of the individual rituals is represented in the slices. So this kind of general finding kind of causes us to or emphasizes the need to address this question of how ritual traditions emerged and spread, and subsequently diverged. So we can do this in a systematic and comprehensive way that has not really been done before, using the Maya Hieroglyphic Database. And this database is it's the largest data set of classic Maya writing to date, and it's been cataloged and coded by my collaborators Martha Macri and Matthew Looper. And it contains about 3,000 hieroglyphic texts that have been documented from these stone-carved monuments that have been painted on ceramics, carved into small portable objects, as well as there are a handful of painted books that survived into the 16th century that are also included in the data set. And so this is just an example of what one of these texts would look like. And the way the database is organized is by glyph block. And so a glyph block, it's highlighted there, is just a discrete unit of text that's composed of multiple different signs that can be combined in a variety of different ways to spell a word, or in some cases a phrase. And so we've also documented the sites where these things occur, as well as any calendrical information that's associated with them. And so this data set really provides excellent spatial and temporal coverage to start asking some of these questions about divergence, the spread of these cultural traits, etc. Okay. So fitting with this signaling perspective that I talked about earlier, I like to kind of think of the monumental inscriptions in particular as the Twitter of classic Maya society. So these were fairly short texts, and they were full of information about, they listed personal names, the titles of these rulers, the dates of certain events, as well as the places where these things were happening. They also included information about the socio-political relationships between individuals and between sites, as well as a whole bunch of different life cycle events and rituals. And so it's really chock full of information that I think we can make analogies to today in terms of the way in which text analysis and data mining is kind of happening with social media. So that's how I like to frame that. So for this study, the data set that we're going to be looking at is drawn from a sample of hieroglyphic monuments that contain a calendar date and are from secure archaeological contexts. Again, just to kind of make sure that any inferences that we're making are have those controls in place. So the data set represents 103 archaeological sites spanning the classic period. And this calendar notation is it's the Maya long count system, and so that's I might refer to that, but we know we've worked out the conversion, so we can go back and forth and precisely date things to the day. So it's a very high precision record. So so with those checks in place, we identified 77 unique ritual terms across 1,600 instances. And so this just shows the distribution through time. The blue shows the ritual frequency through time in relationship to glyph block frequency. So just again, those individual discrete units. Maya terms and hieroglyphic signs to that kind of denote accession. There are scattering rituals, dedication rituals that talk about dedicating certain objects, buildings, monuments. There are also sort of more antagonistic kinds of rituals, like capturing and falling. So when a site is destroyed, or when an individual is captured from another site. And then at the bottom we have these the three that we talked about previously: impersonating, dancing, and conjuring. Okay. So this is just a histogram showing the dynastic rituals in the data set with more than 2 occurrences. So accession rituals are by far and away the most common. And what we see is a very steep drop off from there with a very long tail. So we have a very large number of rituals that occur in very low frequency. So here again, you'll see those accession rituals appear at almost all of the sites, excluding just a couple of small ones in the southern lowlands, and then some of these larger sites in the northern lowlands. And that's kind of regardless of size. So you see big sites and small sites with, inscribing these accession rituals. Sorry, those dots are kind of small. To control for sampling effects due to small sample sizes, so sites that have a few hieroglyphic monuments, we examined the relationship between ritual frequency and the number of glyph blocks at each site. So here we see that as sample size increases, so as we go out along the x-axis, the variance decreases. And this violates some assumptions of normal distributions. And so to compensate for that, we removed all the samples that have less than 100 glyph blocks in the analysis. And like by a rough estimate, 100 glyph blocks is maybe about 5 monuments at a site. So just kind of on average. Okay. So then after removing those, the small problematic samples, this plot shows a positive relationship between ritual richness, so the number of unique rituals, and sample size. And so, as we would expect, sites with larger hieroglyphic records have a larger set of dynastic ritual inscriptions. And so this relationship is just pointing out that these are, even the smaller sites are recording fewer different types of rituals. They're all kind of drawn from the same population. So we can make valid statements about them. So this map visualizes that relationship. So sites are color-coded by the number of different rituals recorded at each site, and then again the size of the circles represents the relative number of glyph blocks at each site. So in most cases, the small sites have less than 5 unique rituals, while the larger sites are more ritually rich. And then the labeled sites are really large sites with over 500 glyph blocks recorded. So this map is informative, but it doesn't tell us what the rituals were, their frequency, their relative frequency, or how they were kind of distributed. And we kind of need that information in order to understand how these things spread. So here's another representation of the data, and this gets us a little bit closer, but because this data set is so multidimensional, it's difficult to visualize in these ways. So this is just the sites that have over 500 glyph blocks, so there's really large sites, and just the top 12 rituals. And so what we can see is that, again, like these accession rituals are ubiquitous and occur in a relatively high frequency, except at this one site, Chichen Itza, which is in the north and late. The rest is kind of a mess to make sense of, but we can just kind of eyeball it and say it looks pretty heterogeneous, but can we do better than that? So we will try. So now we're going to try to quantify this using a method that's common to population genetics, and that's called the fixation index, or FST. And this measure has recently been adopted by a number of in a number of studies excuse me, that look at cross-cultural diversity of different traits. And to my knowledge, this is the first time that this has been applied to kind of a within to look at diversity within a particular culture. So here we apply this measure to look at how ritual variation is partitioned within and between a population, and in this sense, a population is a site. So FST is calculated by the ratio of the difference between the mean estimates of subgroup diversity and the estimate of population diversity over the estimated population diversity. And so the measure, it's a really basic measure. It just goes from 0 to 1. So an FST of 0 indicates that all the diversity in the population is represented within each group, within each subgroup. And there's little differentiation among those subpopulations. So in this case, that would be like the sites are doing similar sets of things. An FST value of 1 indicates that there is great differentiation amongst the subpopulations, suggesting that all of the differentiation is between subpopulations, and there's no variation within the subpopulation. So, okay, so we can do this for the looking at so we can use this for the calculating the Simpson's diversity index with the ritual frequency data. And so our results show that when we exclude small samples, 20% of the variation can be accounted for between sites. And this is a relatively high magnitude, especially when we compare this with some of these contemporary cross-cultural studies. And it's also surprising because since we're dealing with a single culture that is, they're all erecting these hieroglyphic monuments, they're all writing in the same script, we might expect to find a more uniform distribution if these rituals were part of kind of these standardized royal obligations of kings. Okay, so then we can ask what factors contribute to this population structure. And so we investigated the role of space as a first pass variable in structuring the differentiation of dynastic rituals mentioned in these texts. And so to do this, we calculate the differentiation between site assemblages using this Bray-Curtis similarity index, which just measures the shared differences between counts of traits and ignores instances when sites share no observation. And then we can just use a simple Mantel test to evaluate the correlation between ritual dissimilarity and spatial distance. And so interestingly, our results show more covariance between ritual similarity and spatial distance is accounted for with smaller glyphic records, when smaller glyphic records are excluded from the analysis. So this again, so we did it for all three samples. We did it for all sites, including those very small sites with more than 100 glyph blocks, and sites with these very large sites show a very high proportion of spatial patterning accounting for this population structure. So sites that are close to each other, this is just another way to kind of represent that the contribution of geographic distance to the population structure. So sites that are close to each other exhibit similar dynastic ritual records, and then so we can visualize this with this Mantel parallelogram. And so it's just showing along the y-axis are the R values at sequential 50 kilometer lags. So, and then the colored dots are significant. So at 50, 100, and 150 kilometers, that's where we see this significant spatial patterning. It's not across the whole entire region. And then we see significant negative correlation at greater distances. And so this, the spatial scale of these findings is robust and validating in some respects because it supports our previous results of finding regional clustering of those bloodletting rituals at 150 kilometer spatial lag. So in this site, the sites are, the red sites indicate high clusters, clusters of high concentrations of bloodletting glyphs, and the white are low concentrations. And this is kind of this is again in comparison to the neighbors at these different spatial lags. Okay, so what have we learned so far? So the hieroglyphic record, using this this database and kind of this quantitative approach allows us to explore a much wider range of dynastic ritual variation than has been discussed or identified previously in the literature. So I talked about those kind of really large sites that have over 500 glyph blocks. Those are probably the best studied and most well known for specialists. And so their intuition and their knowledge is kind of perhaps biased by that. But by looking at a much broader range, we can get a more holistic picture and a more detailed picture, I think. We've also found that there's a relatively high amount of variation between sites, and that raises the question whether these rituals were signals to particular subsets of classic Maya society. So at the scale of the site or at these particular regions. There's also a question, one thing that we kind of need to explore is the role of time in this, and that's something that I'd be happy to kind of talk about afterwards. So in terms of looking at the population structure, our preliminary results indicate some effects due to a small sample size, and we've been able to control for that. So I mentioned that it's important to kind of have this holistic view and to incorporate significant small sites, but it's also important to be able to exclude those noisy data points in the analysis. And then when we account for these sampling effects, we see that geographic distance accounts for a significant amount of variance at particular scales in structuring this population. And so this suggests that there's some degree of regional differentiation and ritual divergence or specialization in these dynastic traditions. So that's all I have. I just wanted to thank you and thank my collaborators again.
Okay, I may have missed this, but do you think that, do you have an idea that per site is actually a different power group, a different individual, or is it, or are those regional sets of sites?
Yeah, so I kind of I glossed over the sort of what we know about classic Maya sociopolitical organization, but basically we can think of these as autonomous kingdoms or city-states, where at each of those centers there is a ruler or some individual in power, and there's kind of a hierarchical structure of how that works. But there's no, I don't know if that's sort of how
So is there, part of what you were talking about was the similarity between the actual communication system through the hieroglyphs regionally. Are there comparable data sets that show comparable exchange of either material or a language?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've done previously, it's again using the hieroglyphic record as a baseline, but these texts also, they talk about relationships between individuals and between sites. So royal visits of people going places, and so I've done some social network analysis of that. But what we'd like to do in the future is to add additional material or culture variables into this to look at exchange of other ceramics, other kinds of goods to to kind of add to that as another layer in the
exchange.
yeah.
I have some really fundamental questions because it's a very dense data set for me. But I felt like my first take-home message was there's a really high turnover rate in who's at the top. Because you have accessions like everywhere, which means like it doesn't really, your longevity as being at the top of the heap is going to be short because somebody else's little face is going to be painted over yours quickly. And then the second thing that I don't know about Mayan, like who's reading this? Like who are they signaling? Can the populace walk up to a stela and know what it says, or is it just an elite class that only if you can write it can you read it? And so if that's the case, then they're just needing a town crier to tell them what the signal is. So when you look at variability and get a high variability, I don't know who the audience really is that can appreciate the variability other than you and the people who are making the glyphs.
That's a good point. So what we know about literacy is very little, but what people have suggested is that that these were, not that it was sort of the elite royal class that was literate and could both, write and read these things. But other people have argued that the data set that I'm looking at are just these texts that are kind of on hieroglyphic monuments, so in pretty large public, they're accessible to a wide. They potentially would be accessible to a wide audience, and when so they do these kind of rituals on important calendar days of the cycle, and what people have suggested is that there's someone who is perhaps the king himself is reading or enacting what is on these things, and so there's so that information would be accessible to an illiterate audience. But then the question about so who's appreciating this variability or who's like recognizing it. So I mentioned that that we have good evidence of there's a pretty dynamic flow of people on the landscape, especially at the upper levels. And so
you mean like intermarriage, like the elite or intermarrying?
Going to different sites to perform different rituals and things like that.
Oh, they are moving. Okay.
And so that's, I think that would be the target audience for who is able to kind of appreciate. So I think there's multi-level signaling happening, but I think that at the upper levels they would be able to recognize and appreciate those differences that someone a commoner or
so a royal figure being transplanted or loaned out to complete a part of a ritual cycle or something, they're literate enough that they can maybe walk onto a context and appreciate the ritual context that they're placed in, because they can probably know from reading around them what their part in the bigger picture is.
One of the things that one of the points that I was trying to make is that there is this variability, but it's all these rituals kind of form this what we can kind of maybe think of as a classic Maya ritual tradition, but people or sites are selectively inscribing or performing or specializing in certain ones and making choices about what to what not to do.
Complicated.
Yeah.
Hi Jessica, thank you. Sort of riffing off of your your question in terms of accessibility and intelligibility. I'm wondering if you sort of looked into sort of semiotics and stuff like this in terms of trying to understand this notion of, indexes and, reference or things like that in terms of, understanding sort of the process of enculturation, socialization, whereby an individual could be able to sort of comprehend, or at the very least, whether legitimately or peripherally understand some of the things that are being signaled through these hieroglyphs and such. And so I guess the process would be something akin to, Mesoamerica has been sort of defined in various ways, and now we understand it as shared practices along, the time in a specific kind of area, much like the United States is a big, vast area where there are differences in each state and each city and whatnot, but we all, to some degree participate in understanding what Americans is supposed to be about, right? And the symbols that are signals that, we all participate to one degree or another in what it means to be American. So that symbols become sort of, either taken for granted or very, very pointedly utilized or deployed or mobilized among different groups of different populations and such. And so I can see how it would be, there would be variation given, we all are sort of different people participating to different degrees in a specific cultural group of people, but participate in it differently, but it wouldn't be difficult to, for these things to be intelligible, even if we weren't as literate as whether the elite or not. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some, I think the one of the interesting points though, I think, is that there's, people, I mean, in the literature have talked about, this elite level and have kind of homogenized that and, and grouped that all together. And so this is really trying to pick that apart a little bit and to look at how, what are the differences and how is that information being shared. I think in terms of how is this information impacting other levels of society or other communities is a very challenging question to address archaeologically. But it's one that I think is, I mean, it's interesting, but yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to kind of look at these differences and to be able to say, okay, well, we have this, like, this cultural repertoire that we as, archaeologists kind of like talk about, and but to be able to, parse it out and to look at these differences, I think is a
Okay.
Yeah.
There's one observation and one question. One is just that the bloodletting sites seem to be very highly restricted to the uplands and the base of the uplands versus the lowlands with the other kinds of ritual sites, right?
Yeah.
Non-bloodletting sites. So I don't know what that means, but it just means that. And then that since the overall arc of the Mayan civilization is one of rise and ultimate collapse, and the fact that diversity of ritual becomes more and more dominant towards the end time, before the collapse, that costly signaling may be having more to do with fractionation and division, which actually means less power, not more power.
Yeah, no, and if we were to look at the frequency of antagonistic statements, so things like about conflict and warfare, I think we would see a very strong correlation there. And or another way to kind of look at it would be to look at the number of different individual rulers. So we see during that time period that there's an explosion of competing kings on the landscape, and so
or just ritual intensification because things are going to hell and you better affect the change.
On one hand, it's an
ritualistically.
attempt to maintain your way that's maybe under the gun now, and the other is trying to differentiate yourself from your neighbor because you don't like him anymore, right?
Yeah.
So.
I wonder if it's also important to sort of, just bring up the problematic notion of collapse in general.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, about that whole idea is kind of sort of tied to actually this, like, the pattern of when these monuments kind of cease. And so there's some, I don't know, it's hard, it's, you know, to disentangle those arguments is complicated.
I had a question on just the general time dimension of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I think Jack touched on it, but what do you see? Do you see like a temporal change in the structure of these ceremonial rituals? I didn't pick up you might have said it, maybe I missed it, but just a strong temporal variation in this, or maybe maybe you're viewing that a little bit more informally.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we are sort of looking at next. And
Right.
so all of the rituals that we have in our data set are dated, and so they have an event date, and so we can track these things, you know, very precisely through time. And our preliminary results show, for most of them, that they, you know, follow this general pattern of just monument production. So as, you know, as more monuments are being produced, we see, you know, increase in accession rituals, increase in scattering rituals, increase in all these things. However, there are a couple of examples that depart from that pattern, which are worthy of further inquiry. Three of them are the three main ones that we talked about at the beginning: the impersonation, the dancing, and the conjuring. And so they depart in such a way that suggests that it's a process of social contagion, of actual, like, cultural transmission of these things, not just a product of monument production. So they follow a different pattern. The other one that is different are the falling rituals, which are associated with kind of destruction of sites. And those, the pattern is such that it suggests that at the outset, when we first see those rituals recorded, they're at their greatest rate of innovation, which means that they appear, like, immediately everywhere. And that's a process of kind of the historical, you know, contingent nature of what's happening sociopolitically, right? That's not a cultural transmission process or social contagion. That's intensification of warfare and conflict. So we are kind of looking at these, like, temporal patterns and trying to make sense of how that
How it fits in.
how that fits in.
Okay, just one material culture question. Is the idea that's really kind of wonderful of painted books versus the stone stellars, which I would assume takes more time to produce, and the painted books, I think, of being less time. Is there sort of a greater diversity of rituals and individuals indicated in the painted books that I know is just a very small sample than there are in the stela?
Yeah, so what we know, they're very different genres. The books are very heavily ritual oriented, but it's not sort of political, historical ritual. It's astronomical, mythological, and a very different genre. But it would be interesting to kind of compare, to make some comparisons lexically or linguistically between those.
Has anybody tried to figure out how long it takes to make one of those stone monuments? I mean, how long are these folks actually in power?
Faster if you're skilled.
Yeah.
I'm keep starting over.
Are these really carved on limestone?
Yeah, they're mostly
So that's a
limestone.
very malleable.
Yeah.
You can do that fast.
Well, it depends also on your artistry. It's like, you can't just be a carver. You have to sort of envision, I would imagine,
Yeah.
sort of what you're drawing.
And there are a few examples of these things being painted too, so it's likely that there's a whole other layer that we're not seeing.
They were, but now it's just
Yeah.
washed and scoured off.
There was a study of Inca primary stone cut architecture by Jean-Pierre Protson
Oh.
at Berkeley, who's an architect. And these notions of how difficult it must be and how time consuming it must be to sort of carve these things. And he went into these sort of like some archaeological sort of situation, and he sat there and he sort of did it himself, carved it on. It was fairly simple. Given sort of the hardness of the stone itself.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So does that mean you
I
can
do have a
order
friend that
wax?
does it, but it takes a while, obviously. You choose the material, you have to,
I think
it's sort of pyramids and then all this stuff.
Yeah, and I think learning the script and the language
Yeah,
is also a
yeah,
huge part of it too.
No language.
Illiterate crafts class.
Yeah.
Because I look at it and I can't even figure, like, what part is signaling? Like, is that even his headdress or is that a different person? Because I don't know the code.
Yeah.
And why are they considered costly signals? I mean, in the sense of the monuments took time to produce, or the ritual communication to the signalee, or
Yeah. So the Fraser Nyman's argument is that they're costly to produce, like the actual production of them. I, in terms of taking away, resources from doing other things, that's sort of the traditional human behavioral ecology notion.
right?
I don't know that that's really. My hunch is that is not necessarily true. That these were already like specialists, and that was.
Yeah, I mean, you're already dealing with the 1%.
Yeah.
Well, and you're sitting around and building, pyramids and stuff. Why is it a big deal to do a stela?
Yeah.
A stela,
Isn't it cheaper than building a pyramid?
I don't. I mean,
It's only a tweet, Kelly.
yeah.
But is it the stela that's the signal, or is it the
Well,
actual
that's
ritual?
the way it's both, right? But the thing that one of the arguments that I would put forward is that these, the documentation and inscription of these things, they are messages that are being recorded that can be read and interpreted by, future generations. And so it's not so much a costly signal as is like a social or cultural signal.
Right.
Yeah, I think
That sounds
that's what I
more
was trying to-
Yeah.
To get at in terms of them not being necessarily the intentionality behind them
Yeah.
as being, encoded sort of little messages that, then I think it's just, the stela, from the little that I know, have been sort of, used as commemorative markers in some ways to also sort of talk about histories of ascension, warfare, and all these marking time and who ruled and whatnot. But I guess what I was trying to sort of say earlier is that whether you're in the elite sort of ranking in the society, even the most sort of common of people might participate differentially and would know because of having them perform some of these rituals that they would identify and be able to interpret as something that they already understand. Right? So as I was saying, it's as simple as saying, I'm gonna go to the A's game, right? The letter of the A's, the cap, is able to sort of signal that it is a sport, that this is where we go. We got caught up. Yeah, and all of us, to some degree or another, whether we participate in understanding the rules of the game, are socialized or culturalized to some degree to understand what those things mean. Depending, it doesn't matter how we participate in it or not. We might have some sense of what this means.
Right, there you can. It talks to everybody, but at different depths, sort of.
Right. Potentially.
Any other questions? Jessica, thank you very much.
Thank you.